Hello, this is Daniel King reporting on round one of the FIDE Candidates Tournament from London. 8 players are competing for the golden ticket, a chance to play a World Championship final against Viswanathan Anand. Any of these 8 players, I think, could qualify, but of course the hot favourite is Magnus Carlsen, so it's going to be interesting to see how he did in this first round. He was playing Levon Aronian. Not an easy first game. Well, let's see what happened. Aronian had the white pieces and opened with d4. Now, you might remember that at the London Chess Classic, Carlsen also had the black pieces against Aronian, and Carlsen played rather a dubious King's Indian and almost lost. Aronian almost had him. But in today's game, Carlsen played the very solid Bogo Indian and in fact selected perhaps one of the most solid continuations. You can play with d6 and e5, obviously protecting that pawn first on e5, maybe with queen e7 or knight c6. But in today's game, Carlsen played d5. Now, this is a favourite variation of Ulf Andersson in the 1980s, and indeed Spassky, who used to play this variation in order to make a quick draw and then go off and play some tennis. And that's kind of what happened today. Now, the idea is queen e7, and then you play the rook into the middle. So with this rook lined up against the queen, that's a little bit uncomfortable for white, so the queen nudges over. Now, let me show you a typical Andersson-Spassky game in this line. Well, for example, if black takes here, you play c5, and if both players are feeling peaceably inclined, then lots of pieces get chopped off on the C and D files. And well, you can see how this game is going to very quickly liquidate to a draw. Carlsen kept a little bit more tension in the position with a6. Now, what he's hoping is to win the so-called battle of the tempo. He's waiting for white to play the bishop out, and only then will he take on c4, and in that way he wins some time. But okay, Aronian waited too with a3, and Carlsen waited as well, knight d7, but also brings out a piece at the same time. Now here, I think if white wants to make anything of this opening, I think you have to exchange on d5, and then perhaps play, well, maybe knight a4, and play for some kind of minority attack, perhaps later with b4, and perhaps play the knight into c5. But of course, black is very solid here. You're going to perhaps play your knight into e4. I mean, this is a very typical situation where black tries to generate play on the king side or in the center. It has this nice outpost for the knight on e4, and white is playing on the queen side. But I think that's what white has to do, has to try to unbalance the position if you're going to make anything of it. But Aronian was playing very calmly today, but rather cautiously. He played bishop e2. So in a sense, black has gained a tempo here. This a6 move is very useful indeed, because you can throw in b5. There we go. Gaining space on the queen side, preparing to bring the bishop to b7. After the bishop comes to b7 and the rook comes to c8, I don't think white has any advantage in this position at all. Aronian took on c5. Now, after the game, he said that he'd originally intended playing the knight back to a2, and he thought he might have some advantage here. If, for example, after the queen exchange, then perhaps you can play your knight from b4 into c6. Maybe there's a chance to get the rook into c7. But in fact, well, both players realize that after queen b6, this is absolutely nothing for white, because if the queen penetrates to c7, well, this rook can just be knocked back again. And well, in this situation, I think black could even stand better. I mean, he has no difficulties whatsoever. So Aronian basically decided at this point to play absolutely solidly and go for a draw. So after this, he castled. Well, both players have developed their pieces, and now Aronian liquidated all the pawns on the queen side. And after this, well, actually, Aronian was very careful. He made sure he was going to get a draw by liquidating the queens here, and only then capturing the pawn on b5. And now there really is nothing in the position. And well, there's one of the rules here is that you're not allowed to offer draws before move 30. So the players dutifully played a few more moves, and at move 31 agreed a draw. So a slightly disappointing beginning for Aronian with the white pieces. One would have hoped he could press a bit against Carlsen, but for Carlsen, rock solid with black. Solid start. Okay, let's look at some other games. I thought the most interesting game today, although it didn't last for very long, was actually Svidler against Kramnik. Peter Svidler here, a six-time Russian champion, although one of the lowest ranked in the tournament, but a six-time Russian champion. You know, he could easily win the tournament. Any of these players could win the tournament. So here we go. What did he have in his locker against Kramnik? Here, okay, everything pretty normal. Well, we've seen Kramnik play the Nimzo-Indian, he plays the Slav, but here, slight surprise, he played, well, a Queen's Gambit. He could have, of course, just recaptured with the pawn, but instead, he played the so-called semi-Tarrasch variation. Well, this has a very solid reputation indeed. I mean, a little bit passive for black, but very solid. Now, the idea is that after knight f3, you can trade more pieces, perhaps not the most adventurous, but very, very solid. And in this position, well, this has pretty good reputation as black. You know, white has some center, but you know, you get your pieces out very, very easily with black. So after c5, Svidler played an interesting move actually. a3. Now this is the kind of move that you know, if I have a pupil who's playing these little moves at the side of the board, you know, I'll tick them off. Terrible. You should be developing your pieces. But of course, the point of a3 is to prevent this simplification with bishop b4 check. So in that sense, it's well motivated, but it does take up time. Kramnik took on d4. Now, if he plays normal moves like bishop e7, then we can see the point that white is able actually to develop quite nicely and actually try to gain a potential attack against black's king. And with the bishops on the board, the attack is more potent. So Kramnik reacted very swiftly. Well, I think he you know, tried to take advantage of the fact that white is kind of wasting a move with a pawn move at the side of the board, and offered a pawn. Very dynamic indeed. But if this is taken, actually, I think a check is going to regain the pawn very quickly. White could close with d5, but after blockading the pawn, actually black can develop very, very easily and has, I think, quite a comfortable game. So Svidler played knight f3. Svidler admitted after the game that, well, he wasn't entirely sure about what was going on in this position, but clearly Kramnik had prepared this variation very well indeed and was playing his moves very quickly. So Kramnik exchanged, the queens came off, but here, well, this has actually been played once before, and black played bishop c5, which is possible, but after this move, well, you could say that black's pieces are slightly uncomfortably placed. I don't particularly like the knight on a6. Kramnik played bishop e7, and in this position, well, it looks as though white perhaps is gaining some advantage here. He has nice central control with e4. Maybe that bishop could sink itself on d5. So, for example, after bishop d7, bishop d5, well, in this kind of position, black's pawns have been damaged, and white certainly has some advantage there. So knight d7, good move. That means that if the bishop comes to d5, then the knight can challenge with knight f6. King e2. Now, well, if knight f6 here, I don't like this move actually, because then f3 kind of shuts out black's knight. You know, this is a problem. I think white's development is very good here. It's not easy to see how black continues. I think white's plan is very, very easy. You know, you can continue with this minority attack on the queen side. So, okay, knight b6, an interesting move, and bishop b7. Now, the knight doesn't seem to sit very easily on b6. You know, white has sometimes a plan to advance the a pawn. But if a4, then actually rook c8. And just for a moment, I think black is okay. You know, if he can bring the knight into c4 and challenging on the c file, well, you can exchange and the a pawn could be en prise. So I think around about here, well, in fact, through the entire game, I think Kramnik played precisely, really accurately, and I think minimized any disadvantage. Let's have a look. Knight f5. Okay, that's a very challenging move, actually. I think what Svidler is hoping for is this position where he has the two bishops. This knight is controlled by the bishop on b3, and although white's pawns have been damaged a little bit, there's doubled f-pawns, in fact, this majority can still be potent. No doubt about it, white has the advantage there. So instead, Kramnik played bishop f6, and okay, the rook came across, and rook fd8. Very cool move indeed, very precise from Kramnik actually. And now after rook hc1, I mean, it's very hard to actually gain the advantage now with white. Let's see how the game ended. Bishop b5 check, and bishop d3. So black has just enough activity here. And after bishop c2, bishop a6 is an excellent move. This is very clever maneuvering with the bishop. The idea is that the bishop now protects the pawn on b7, and that enables the knight to come to c4, after which, well, that's very dangerous. You can see the knight on c4 would hit the pawn on a3, threatens to destabilize the king, and suddenly black is okay. So Svidler put the bishop back on b3, preventing the knight coming to c4, and now of course they're simply repeating the position, and that's how the game ended in a draw. So a short game, but actually quite a tense game. So another draw there. Now in the other two games, we had Gelfand against Radyabov. Now again, there was some kind of safety first chess here. Gelfand played his customary d4, but instead of Radyabov's King's Indian, we had another Bogo Indian actually, and quite a cautious choice from Radyabov. After e4, instead of the standard d5, which can lead to very interesting positions, Radyabov played more cautiously with d6, and well, they reached a kind of Indian position with the pawn on e5. Now it looks as though black has, well, quite a disadvantage in space, but in fact he has quite good harmony in his position. It's difficult to make anything of this space advantage with white here, and certainly, well, after this, let's see what happened. Okay, traded pieces. c6, very solid, and black already threatens to break with d5. You can see this bishop is unprotected. So after bishop c3, let's say, then d5 is rather uncomfortable. And, well, therefore bishop f1 was played, getting out of the line of the rook. But d5 was still an excellent move, because after bishop takes b4, well, you can see how pawns are being traded, and yeah, I'm afraid not too much going on there, and well, more pieces were liquidated, and yeah, ended in a draw. So that one also solid, and The final game to finish here today was Ivanchuk against Grishuk, which started as a Catalan, and again both players played quite cautiously. Now this is, you could say, the main line of the Catalan. And here, well, in recent years, Bishop d2 has received a lot of attention. But Ivanchuk played the old move, Bishop g5. It's very hard to make anything of this move. Again, this is an Anderson, typical Ulf Anderson variation. But really, Black learned how to neutralize this a long time ago. The only thing was, Grishuk confessed afterwards he couldn't remember the theory. It's not his usual opening. This is actually quite an important moment. Here, Grishuk played slightly inaccurately. He played with c5. The key move is Bishop b4, actually. And remarkably, c5. Now, this looks very odd indeed, because the bishop appears to be the wrong side of the pawn. So, what happens after a3? Well, in fact, Black is fine here after c4. And this has been played in several games. It's actually a very well-known theory. And after this, Queen d6, Black recovers the pawn on b4. It's very well known indeed. Clearly not to Grishuk. And here, Black is fine. Alternatively, if d takes c5, here this is very different to the game because the queen stands on d1 blocking the rooks, and really white has nothing in this position. If you compare that position with the game, where c5 was played, and here, well, the queen stands on d2 rather than d1, and white has a little something in this position, but after a few accurate moves from Grishuk, actually he was also fine here. Bishop f1 is an interesting move because perhaps you want to play knight g5, force the bishop off the diagonal, then play bishop g2, but after this, well, really, sorry, after rook c8, Ivanchuk has kind of a symbolic advantage of bishop over knight, but the thing is that knight on d5 is so strong you can't really get rid of it because there's no longer e4. In fact, Black was absolutely fine here, and the game finally ended in a draw. So, 4 draws in the opening round of the Candidates Tournament. All players seem to be quite cautious. I think it's rather typical for these big tournaments where everyone wants to just make a mark on the scoreboard, doesn't want to risk too much. But it's very early days, and I'm sure over the 14 rounds we're going to see some fantastic fighting chess. So, from the Institute of Engineering and Technology here in London, here in the press room, good night, and I shall see you with more reports from here over the coming 2 weeks. Thanks very much.